I am Jason Rosario. I am the founder and creative director of the Lives of Men, which is I'll call it an integrated media creative platform, social impact platform that's dedicated to helping men navigate and explore healthier and more inclusive forms of masculinity. I've always been very present to being an Afro-Latino young man growing up in the Bronx, product of a single parent home, oldest of a total of 7 kids. All of that sort of informed my awareness of and my experience of growing up and becoming a man. I created the Lives of Men initially as a blog, so to speak. So something that kind of just chronicled my own story and my own journey. And in the act of sharing that with a friend of mine at the time, he was just like, this is something that I'm experiencing. There are aspects of this that I can certainly relate to. There are other men that I'm sure are experiencing or have experienced very similar things. And so, I decided to sort of put it out in the world. And then, as the universe would have it, Me Too happens, and all of a sudden, I find myself in the middle of a public discourse around what does it mean to be a man.
With this kind of public platform, has anything changed for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think to be honest with you, I never started off with a definition of what it meant to be a man. I just kind of was moving about the world and, sort of existing and being, if you will. And of course, a lot of that was informed by my environment. I'm a product of a lot of really amazing women in my life. So, the sort of what they taught me, watching and observing their experiences with men, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. So, and then of course, peer pressure and culture and all of the things. So, I can't say that I had a clearly defined definition starting out, but I will say that as I've done this work, I absolutely have developed, I don't want to say a definition, but at least a North Star around sort of what works for me and what I think being a man is. And that is, someone who is present to his life, present to how he shows up in the world, and is able to move with dexterity between being soft and being tender and sort of being emotionally in tuned and self-aware, and then toggling between that and saying, where are the moments where I need to be strong and where are the moments where I need to really lead and protect. And I think the around protection in particular is something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, because in this world now, when you fast forward to 2025, all of this conversation around men and sort of what it means to be a man, the word protector comes up, the word provider comes up often, and always of the mind that you can't protect without healing yourself. Like, what are you gonna protect if you can't heal yourself? And so I think that is the ultimate form of providing and protecting, and that is taking the time as a man to, really sit with yourself and develop the emotional capability and emotional intelligence to be able to be in service to the world, right? The people in your life and your community writ large. The phrase sit with yourself is so often overused in these sort of woo-woo, new age conversations, right? About healing and self-discovery. But it really was an act of sitting with myself and taking the time to say, I'll give you an example. I was experiencing a breakup, and the up till that point, all of the advice that you get usually as a man is, well, just go date around until you get over it. And, you'll eventually find someone and you'll forget about this, this other person. And I had done that, of course, to no success, to no degree of success. And so in this particular moment of time when I was experiencing a breakup for another moment, I decided to take a step back and do something different. And that was, I'm not going to date. I'm not going to entertain anyone else. And I am really going to sit with myself, and I'm really going to, listen to and confront whatever comes up in this moment of solitude. And that was a prolonged moment, right? A prolonged series of months where I would date myself. I would take myself out. I would, I enlisted in therapy and really sort of journaled and, and this is going to sound crazy, but I developed the habit of talking to myself out loud.
It doesn't. I
Um,
love it.
yeah, all with the efforts of, really just kind of getting to the root of who Jason really was and what made him tick and sort of what he needed at that moment to heal.
Did that change you as a father?
Yeah, I mean, I think it prepared me, although, I had my daughter at 21 years old, just graduated from college, so kid myself in many respects. And so, I can't say I'm not one of those men that says, oh, well, I started to care about this work, masculinity, as it were, because I had a daughter. And
Right.
I just feel like that's such a cop out, right? Like
Yeah.
you had a mom, you had a sister, and all of that before, right? But be that as it may, I think it definitely softened me up. It definitely prepared me to when the time was right. I don't want to say that it happened immediately, but years later as she got older, I mean, the compounding effect of me doing the self-reflective work and developing the language to articulate my feelings and my thoughts and my emotions, and then also self-regulate, but also co-regulate, really helped me as a father, because then when she was in her high school years and her teenage years, we were able to have the types of meaningful conversations that serve as the bedrock to a relationship, a parent relationship, a parent-child relationship, that was rooted in transparency and honesty, and I would say radical honesty. It taught me a lot about managing my own ego as a parent, right? And allowing her voice to emerge. And so, yeah, absolutely. All of that was a product of me having taken the time to do the work that I did. My journey to sort of developing the ability to self-regulate started in therapy with my therapist advising and actually teaching me how to take a moment and take a breath physically, right? Before I responded to something. And that alone being the difference between reaction and response is
Yeah.
that moment of breath. And so that was, super critical for me, not just in terms of me being a parent and me leading this work and working with other men, but even as a person growing in his career, as an executive, navigating difficult conversations in the boardroom or difficult situations at work. And so it was incredibly helpful to learn how to be in my body. And I think that's important, especially as men, because to the extent that we talk about being in our bodies, we're talking about going to the gym, working out, getting a six pack, and then looking at the external outcomes of that, right? Whether it's how, your body fat and how you look, your muscles and all that. But I think the internal aspects of really taking the time to know and be in your body and identify your trigger points and your those things in your mind and your body that are real markers of something's off here are really important.
And then knowing that and how to navigate your internal landscape, then you're
That's right.
better able to navigate other people's landscapes.
Yeah, it started happening, I would say early on in college, and I didn't have the language for it, but I was in various leadership groups. And, there's nothing like being out in front leading that really forces you to, to really think about, the way that you communicate to people, the way that people receive you, the way that you show up in spaces and in rooms. I think that was a really formative experience for me. I think the other part was that as a look, I'm a 6'4" black man, and I know how I show up in spaces. And my presence alone, you can't ignore me, right? You can't not see me when I walk into a space. So I've always been very aware of sort of how I use my tone, my voice, how I take up space physically, and how that might potentially impact someone else. And so you combine that with the level of self-awareness that you develop when you start to really understand yourself and your trigger points and all that. I think that just creates this dynamic where as a man you start to become a very I don't know what the word is, but you start to become grounded in who you are. And I don't know if I'm sure you have come across many men who move in spaces where you're just like, how are they moving so freely and so effortlessly and so confidently? And that's because they've taken the time to really understand who they are, what they bring to a space, but then also how that then interacts and impacts the people that they're interacting with. So I think self-regulation and co-regulation, of course, go hand in hand. I think the way I try to simplify it and have people who don't come to this conversation with the language that, say, you and I have, or the perspective that you and I have, is to say, look, think about the pressures to perform masculinity, right? What we call toxic masculinity. So that's the stoicness, the aggression, the hyper risk taking. All of these attributes that we celebrate in men are actually markers for depression or something being very, very wrong in men, right? Because what happens is in men, when we don't have the opportunity to express and fully or feel fully seen and heard, then we tend to replace that need with something else. And that need then shows up in what we call toxic masculinity. So, I often say that this conversation around how do we raise boys to be better men, to be healthier men, is also a conversation about mental health. You can't unlink the two. I think that there's a really good book that I love by Dr. Terry Real. It's called "I Don't Want to Talk About It." It's funny because and I'll actually share the link with you too
Oh, please do.
because he was on the New York Times The Daily podcast over the weekend,
Okay.
and he was talking about sort of his work as a therapist and how he works with men specifically. But in his book, he talked about the fact that studies show that young boys are much more emotionally expressive than young girls before the age of 5. And so what happens after the age of 5? It's that they start to hear things like boys don't cry. When they're experiencing some consternation, they're like, that's when they start to hear man up, things like that. And so you start to separate the young man and that boy from their emotions. And then that, of course, carries through into adolescence and adulthood. And so, that's where this is not accidental. This is architectural, right?
Yes.
This is all part of sort of the ways that, to use another term, jargon, the patriarchy works, right? Is that, there's a system designed to separate men. And then once that separation occurs, then there's the stratification of men where it puts men at the top and then everyone else under that. So I think there is an inextricable link to mental health in this conversation around what's happening with men and boys.
Yeah, and I was gonna say, so do you know Dr. Judy Chu?
Yes.
She has this great line where she says, as early as 5, boys start trading pieces of their humanity for social
Mm,
currency. And that
that's
it's,
right.
and that's like why I start so young, because I'm like, if I can get them young, that it's just then them retaining their emotional intelligence instead of being treated like a problem. So I'm curious about that piece though, in terms of I mean, right now we're living in a fascist state. So like,
Right.
again, I can't even with this country. Okay. But if we like take that aside and just look at capitalism, right? And in terms of success, how do you see a bridge? Because it seems like you're doing it. So this is kind of what I'm trying
Mhm.
to get from you is the bridge between that grounded, like good mental health, self-regulation, ownership of self, and then how that translates in the work world. Like, I just feel
Mm.
like if more people could understand that element, like that if you have that, you can actually be successful, like more people might be invested in it.
Yeah. Well, I do want to say there's so many things there that I want to unpack, but
Yes,
I do want
please.
to say something about the neo-fascist moment in time that we find ourselves in. But I think there we laugh, but I think there's a reality to this and a truth to this, and that is the leader of the free world is also mentally ill.
Yes.
And there is no coincidence that you're seeing, that multiple people have said that he exhibits signs of severe mental illness, and you're also seeing him exhibit these severe signs of toxic, what we'll call toxic masculinity, patriarchal behaviors, right? All the way back to 2016, and that the video that came out and all that stuff. I don't have to rehash
Yeah.
the history of it all, but it's all connected, right? And so I think that to me, and I want to come back to your question, but I think that to me is what makes this work incredibly important. And I don't want to overstate this. This is not hyperbole, but this is also about saving democracy,
Yes.
right? You're seeing a faction of the type of men who are holding on to the remnants of power and sort of feeling attacked and feeling threatened by sort of the increased in whether it's diversity, whether it's the multitude of our society, they're holding on to this power because they feel threatened, and that is all rooted in sort of their views of what men's roles are in our society. So this is very much the work that you do, the work that I do is very much about, in the grand scheme of things, about saving our democracy, saving our society, and saving our planet. I've done a lot of work to really get to the root of what I think my purpose is in this lifetime, and that is to be the highest expression of love in every area of my life. And when I say love, I don't just mean romantic love. I
Yeah.
mean love as a verb, as something that you do, as something that you offer. And I do believe that that is, to me, one of the most worthwhile pursuits that any man should aspire to, and that is to be in service. To be in service and to say, what would it look like for me as a leader, as someone who has a certain privilege as a man? What would it look like for me to spend that privilege in service of the women in my life, the LGBTQ plus community, marginalized groups, whatever? But what would it look like for me to spend that privilege in service of? And I think that, to me, being able to do that, being able to do it confidently, to your point, and not feel threatened, right? But by something or someone else taking something away from you, is the truest sense of provider and protector that there is.
Amen. Right? Like mic drop.
What I see right now, in terms of what's happening with men in the discourse, is that there's a lot of sort of telling men what they're not, and telling men where we've fallen short. And I think part of the answer moving forward, and this is a response to what we saw in 2018, 2017 with Me Too, is that there was an overcorrection towards shut up towards men. We don't
Yeah.
want to hear from you. You've already behaved badly enough. Let us take it from here. You just shut up and stand to the side. And then that's what's created the current echo chamber that we're in right now, where men don't feel heard, they don't feel seen, and they're lashing back out. I would equate that to the same dynamic that, look, I lead diversity, equity, and inclusion at my company. And so, same thing happened. George Floyd happened in 2020. There was an overcorrection towards, we want to fight for equity and all that. And then now we're seeing the complete opposite of that, right? We're seeing the pendulum swing back. To answer your question, what do I think is part of the answer? Part of the answer is that we need the people themselves, the people that have been abused, and in this case, men. We need men to step up and be part of the solution. I'd equate it with, oftentimes in the equity diversity space, we talk about marginalized people, whether it's women or people of color, left with having to do the emotional labor to advocate on their own behalf,
Yes.
right? Having to advocate for equity and justice on their own behalf, and not seeing enough allyship in that conversation. I would say in this instance, we want to, it's a little bit of the opposite, right? We want the people that have been in positions of power, that have been harmed by that position of power, and that is patriarchy, in the front, leading from the front, and saying we all need to change for the betterment of not only our lives but everyone else. And so we need to recruit men that feel like they're on the sidelines, that feel marginalized, that feel like they don't have a voice. And then the way we recruit them is by inviting them and saying, look, we love you, we see you, and we hold space for you. That's not to say that we're going to make excuses for you. That's not to say that we're going to take away from the progress that needs to still needs to be made for women, but we're going to make sure that you are not left behind. And I think that's part of the conversation that I'd like to see more of, is that there's a collective shared responsibility here to combat the patriarchy. And for whatever reason, there's this feeling that there's, a group of people fighting it on this side, and then there are a group of people fighting it on that side. It's just like, no, we have to come together and do this, because the patriarchy harms everyone in
Everyone.
different ways. And so this is a shared responsibility.
And it's interesting you use the language of making sure that men don't feel left behind. That's a
Right.
huge part of what's happening, right? And why Andrew Tate is able to radicalize
Yeah.
so many young boys and men. In your work, have you come across that? And have you been able to, well, let me ask you that first part. Have you come across that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the young people call it the red pill conversation online.
Yeah.
It's, the idea that you have these far right echo chambers coming in and filling the gap and filling the void, for this, sort of source of inspiration that young men are looking for. So absolutely, I'm coming across that, and I think what we need to do, part of what you and I are doing in different ways, is filling the gap from the other side, right? Saying, okay, so if men and young men and boys are increasingly online, then how do we meet them where they are with the type of content, the type of storytelling, the type of inspiration that they're looking for, that feels attainable, that feels accessible, right? I think that's the other thing. We have to make sure that we're not just talking up here, that we're bringing the conversation down and saying, here is where we need to meet you, and here's where we're willing to offer you some, information that you might be able to resonate with. I think that's what's needed to combat sort of the Andrew Tates and the Rogans of the world.
Right. When you say accessible, what do you think's not accessible?
I think part of it is what I mentioned earlier. It's, first of all, we need to stop beating men with the you have been behaving badly hammer, right?
Yeah.
Obviously, there's an imbalance in the ways that men have shown up relative to everyone else. That's obvious. It's why the world is in the state that it's in. I think that you can do two things can be true. You can tell men, you can hold men accountable, but you can also love men. I
Yes.
also think that the purest form of love is accountability.
Yeah.
And so I think if you hold men accountable and love them at the same time, you would be surprised. Not you particularly, but
Yeah,
the
no, I know what
world
you're
would
saying.
be surprised.
Collective view, right?
Yeah, yeah, we would really be surprised at the level of resilience and the level of what we get back in return. And I just think that as a society, we're afraid to give men the type of love and care that they deserve, that they need, because we're afraid that they're going to take that and then continue to oppress. And I'm a big optimist, and I'm a big believer in restorative justice. And I think if you do it the right way, I think we'd be surprised, and we can all be better for it.
I feel like you have some really, really good advice here for men becoming better men. I mean, for sure. Like I can list a couple of things you've kind of said that makes it accessible. Like, oh, I can go sit with myself and not in
Mhm.
like a woo-woo way, in like a real way. I can work on co-regulation. I can do this. Other than those things, because I think becoming a better person and taking that radical accountability and being love is going to help parenting, right?
Mhm.
But is there anything else that you would want parents of young boys to know?
Yeah, this is for parents, but I think it's also applicable for, if you believe in the age-old adage that says it takes a village to raise
Yeah.
a child.
Aunts,
I do believe
uncles, grandparents, yes.
100%. But
Caregivers.
even that, beyond that, I would say that what I encourage men to do, just even in my own community, is to get out there and mentor a boy or a young man that's not in your family, that you're not related to. I think that's incredibly important for a young man to be able to say, look, I have a community of people that, of course, my family cares about me. It's almost like their job to make sure that I'm okay. But this person he's chosen to sort of mentor me and be there for me. That connection is powerful, right? So I would encourage, if there's a man listening to this conversation, I would say go out there and mentor a young man that's not related to you, and spend the time there. I'd also say that, for young men or boys, I would say is think about, if you're a father raising a young boy, think about the importance of your role in his life, not just as an example of what it looks like to be a man, but the very real, tangible impact that you have in helping develop self-esteem. I mean, think about the first man that a young boy is looking to impress is his father in the backyard. He's throwing the baseball around. He's like, good job, son, right? Like those things compounded over time really build self-esteem and character. And I think that's also, if I had to rephrase the crisis of masculinity that we're not in a crisis of community and connection. We're in a crisis of, self or affirmation of young boys and men. We need to affirm these men. And so I think those are just two things that come off the top of my head.
Is there anything you would advise that men can do, like fathers, or men who are not fathers but who are in children's lives, like what you'd want to see them modeling?
I'll share what what I've committed to in raising my daughter. And I sort of did this because I was very aware of a man sort of disciplining a young lady, and not I've never hit my daughter, I've never disciplined her physically, but always chose to use language as a way to, and tone as a way to communicate certain things. So one thing that I would hope men would model more is to be vulnerable and to share more about themselves, share more about their fears, their insecurities, the things that they're excited about, their interests with their children. Because, I grew up in an environment where my mom could do no wrong. She was superwoman. And that's because that's sort of how she showed up with us. She was like, I am the end all be all. I am the head of the household, and you guys are not going to run my life. But I
Right.
understand, I understand she did that out of need, right? Out of survival. And I think, because of that, we grew up with the sense of, mom being superwoman and she could do no wrong. And then that had a negative effect in that we didn't feel comfortable going to her with the, soft underbelly of our emotions sometimes. So I would say, for men, or just parents in general, as you're
Yeah.
raising kids, don't underestimate the power of vulnerability in raising your child. They'll still respect you. You'll still establish those lines, but it goes a long way. It's something that you'll make an investment in when they're younger that hopefully pays out in the future.